I had always considered myself a devoted mother and a loving wife, though lately, I had begun questioning how much of that was simply habit. My mornings usually started early, preparing breakfast for Ryan before school, checking emails for work, and trying to squeeze in a little conversation with Lucas before he rushed off to the office. Life had become a quiet routine, predictable and comforting in some ways, yet strangely isolating in others. Ryan was 16 now, tall for his age and endlessly energetic. He had this knack for making friends quickly, and Derek Miller had been his closest companion for over 2 years. Derek was polite, smart, and had a sense of humor that could effortlessly make anyone laugh. I often saw Derek hanging around the house while Ryan was at school, waiting for him, or helping him with a project. At first, it seemed like nothing more than ordinary teenage friendship. One Thursday morning, while Ryan had an early class and Lucas was out for a meeting that would take him through the afternoon, Derek came over to drop off some homework he had borrowed the day before. I remember the moment vividly. He stood there at the door, hands awkwardly in his pockets, and smiled politely. There was an ease about him, a kind of comfortable confidence, that made him seem older than his years, though I reminded myself he was still just a boy. "Hey, Mrs. Harper," he said softly. "I brought Ryan's notes from last week's math class." "Thanks, Derek," I said, taking the papers. Our hands brushed briefly, and I felt a small, strange flutter in my chest, quickly dismissed. I told myself it was silly that we talked for a few minutes as he explained some of the homework problems, and I realized that in all my busy mornings, I had rarely allowed myself to engage in real conversation with anyone outside my family. Derek, in his simple, youthful way, listened attentively, asked questions, and made observations that felt thoughtful. I found myself laughing at a joke he made, one that I knew Ryan would have chuckled at too, but the laughter felt lighter, freer somehow. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table with a lingering sense of unease. What was happening? It wasn't as if anything had truly occurred, but the ease of our conversation, the unexpected comfort, felt dangerous. I had a husband who was loving but often distant, always wrapped up in work. Lucas was never intentionally neglectful, but he was absent in ways that mattered. He missed the subtle jokes, the quiet moments, the shared stories. And here, in my living room, was Derek, just a boy, yet somehow filling a gap that no one else seemed to notice. The days following were no different. Derek would sometimes come over while Ryan was at school, ostensibly to pick up a notebook, drop off an assignment, or return something Ryan had lent him. Our conversations grew longer, and I noticed the subtle shifts in my thoughts, how I found myself looking forward to these small visits, how I remembered details he mentioned, how I started thinking of things I wanted to tell him. One day, I caught myself laughing aloud at a text he had sent me about a school project Ryan had mentioned in passing. It was innocent, of course, about algebra and group assignments, but the humor in his message, the way he phrased it, made me feel a rush of excitement that startled me. I knew it was wrong to feel such anticipation over a teenager's attention, and yet I couldn't ignore it. It was as if the universe had handed me a small, forbidden spark that was hard to resist. The turning point came one late afternoon when Ryan had a field trip. Lucas was out of town on an emergency meeting, and the house felt unusually quiet. Derek came by to return a book Ryan had forgotten at school the previous week. He knocked lightly, and when I opened the door, he offered a shy smile, one that made my pulse quicken without reason. "Hi, Mrs. Harper," he said. "I just realized I left this at your house." He handed me the book carefully, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you, Derek," I said, smiling. There was a pause, a silence filled with unspoken words, a kind of tension neither of us fully acknowledged. For a moment, I felt foolish for feeling a spark of connection with a teenage boy, and yet, I couldn't deny the thrill of being seen, of being listened to, of having someone notice me beyond the roles I occupied as mother and wife. I invited him in, under the pretext of showing him something he might find useful for his project. That we sat at the kitchen table, books spread out, but the real conversation drifted away from algebra and literature. We shared small stories about life, school, and dreams. His youthful energy, his curiosity, and his attention made me feel alive in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. I caught myself leaning forward, engaged, and laughing without restraint. Then, without thinking, I said, "When my son was at school, then." My voice trailed off, uncertain. I didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of it lingered in the air. It was a confession, a promise, and an invitation all at once. I could feel the tension, the hesitation, the unspoken possibilities, but I quickly composed myself, reminding myself that boundaries existed for a reason. Derek didn't respond immediately. He simply smiled, slightly embarrassed but perceptive enough to understand that something had shifted between us. And that was enough to set my mind racing. I knew then that the simple innocence of our interactions had begun to blur into something more complicated. Something that could be thrilling and dangerous at the same time. After he left, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart still beating fast. The house felt unusually quiet, but the memory of that afternoon lingered. I told myself it was harmless, that nothing had truly happened, yet I also knew that the emotional line had been crossed. I felt guilty, confused, and strangely exhilarated all at once. That I spent the rest of the day replaying our conversation in my mind, questioning my feelings, and thinking about how easy it had been to connect with someone who genuinely listened. It wasn't just Derek, it was the attention, the understanding, and the thrill of something forbidden, small as it might be. I realized that I was at the beginning of a path I couldn't predict, a story that would challenge my morals, my loyalty, and the very foundation of my family life. And so, it ended with the thought lingering in my mind, when my son was at school, then, a sentence unfinished, a secret unspoken, and a tension unresolved. I knew this was only the beginning. The days after the rainstorm carried with them a quiet restlessness that Daniel could not shake. He woke earlier than usual, sometimes finding himself sitting by the window as if waiting for the sound of Evelyn's bicycle. He told himself it was harmless curiosity, a distraction from the monotony of his life, yet he knew the truth went deeper. Clara remained kind, attentive in her own way, but she seemed absorbed by the routines of cooking, cleaning, and managing the house. Whenever Daniel tried to focus on her words, his mind would drift back to Evelyn's voice, light and effortless, echoing in the corners of his memory. When Evelyn finally returned, the weather was bright, and her smile seemed brighter still. She greeted him warmly, surprised perhaps to see him at the door instead of Clara. Daniel felt a nervous energy in his chest as he returned the bottles. They spoke longer than usual, about trivial things, the changing leaves, the upcoming holidays, the long routes she had to take through neighboring towns. Daniel listened with an intensity that startled even himself, and Evelyn seemed to notice. Her laughter lingered as she rode away, and Daniel stood at the gate for a long time after, watching her disappear from sight. That evening, Clara remarked on his mood. "You seem distracted lately," she said, her voice soft but tinged with concern. "Work," Daniel answered too quickly. "Just work." She nodded, accepting the excuse, though her eyes studied him for a moment longer than usual. As days turned into weeks, those short encounters with Evelyn became more than chance meetings. Daniel began to look forward to them with a quiet intensity, timing his mornings so he could step outside at the right moment. Evelyn, for her part, seemed willing to linger, no longer rushing away after handing over the bottles. They shared stories, some funny, some personal. She told him about her childhood in a small town, about her love for painting when she found the time, and about the way she admired people who seemed settled in their lives. Daniel found himself confessing more than he intended, his frustrations with work, his struggles with Clara's quiet distance, his longing for something he couldn't quite name. Evelyn listened without judgment, her eyes warm, her responses filled with empathy. There was no plan in their closeness, no clear intention, yet with each passing day, the line between casual talk and something deeper began to blur. One afternoon, a sudden storm forced Evelyn to take shelter again. Clara was away at her sister's, leaving Daniel alone in the house. Evelyn hesitated on the porch, glancing at the darkening clouds, and Daniel, without thinking too long, invited her inside. She accepted, setting her satchel on the floor and brushing raindrops from her hair. The house felt different with her presence, as though the walls themselves had shifted. They sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea while the storm rattled the windows. Their conversation flowed easily, laughter breaking through the sound of thunder outside. Daniel watched the way her eyes lit up when she spoke, the way her hands moved with every story. Then came a pause, a silence that stretched just a little too long. Evelyn's gaze lingered on him, and Daniel felt the weight of it. His heart beat faster, the air charged with something unspoken. He wanted to step back, to remind himself of his vows, of Clara, of the life he had built. Yet at the same time, he felt drawn toward Evelyn in a way he had never anticipated. She lowered her eyes, as though realizing the danger of the moment, and let out a quiet laugh to break the tension. "This storm will pass soon," she said softly. Daniel nodded, though his thoughts raced. He wanted to say something, anything, to explain what he was feeling, but words failed him. Instead, he busied himself with pouring more tea, pretending not to notice the flush in his own cheeks. The hours passed, and when the rain finally eased, Evelyn stood reluctantly. "I should go," she said. Her voice carried a note of hesitation, as if leaving felt harder than it should. Daniel walked her to the door. For a moment, they stood there, neither moving. Then, almost instinctively, she reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. It was the lightest of touches, fleeting, but enough to ignite something deep inside him. Evelyn quickly withdrew, offering a small smile. "Thank you for the tea," she said before stepping out into the damp air. Daniel closed the door slowly, his chest tight. He leaned against the wood, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, yet part of him longed for the risk, for the spark Evelyn had awakened. In the days that followed, the memory of that touch haunted him. He replayed the moment endlessly, wondering if it had meant as much to her as it had to him. His conversations with Clara grew shorter, his excuses more frequent. She noticed, of course. One evening, as they sat in silence after dinner, she finally spoke. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm but firm, "are you hiding something from me?" The question struck him like a stone. He shook his head quickly, forcing a reassuring smile. "No, Clara. Of course not." But the doubt lingered in her eyes, and Daniel felt the first crack widening between them. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued to arrive, her presence as captivating as ever. Their conversations grew softer, more personal, filled with pauses heavy with unspoken feelings. They never said what lingered in the air between them, but each glance, each smile, each hesitation carried more weight than words ever could. One evening, Daniel found himself waiting by the gate long before she was due. When Evelyn finally appeared, the setting sun cast a golden glow around her. She slowed as she reached him, her expression gentle, almost knowing. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Evelyn said quietly, "We should be careful." Daniel nodded, though his heart ached at the truth in her words. Careful. It was a warning, a reminder of the boundaries they were both skirting. Yet even as he agreed, he knew that carefulness was already slipping away, replaced by a desire neither of them dared to name. As she rode off, Daniel remained at the gate, the evening air cool against his skin. He told himself again and again that it was harmless, that nothing had truly happened. But deep inside, he knew that the storm was no longer outside his house, it was inside him, growing stronger with every passing day. The days that followed carried a strange rhythm I had never known before. My mornings began with the same routine: coffee brewing in the kitchen, David leaving early with a distracted kiss on my cheek, and the house falling into its heavy silence. But now, there was something new lingering in my thoughts. I found myself listening for footsteps outside, waiting for that knock on the door, or glancing through the window to see if Ethan might pass by. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something that lived in the small spaces of my day. I started noticing details about him that I hadn't before: the way his hands moved when he worked, the quiet focus in his eyes, the warmth of his smile when he allowed himself to show it. Those details etched themselves into my mind, growing heavier with each passing moment. One afternoon, I saw him walking by, and without thinking, I called out his name. He turned, hesitant as always, but when he stepped closer, I felt my heart skip in a way that embarrassed me. I asked him if he had time for tea, and he nodded, almost shyly, as though the invitation itself was something fragile. We sat across from each other at the small wooden table in my kitchen. I poured the tea, my hands trembling slightly though I tried to hide it. Our conversation was simple. He told me a little about his family, his studies, his plans. But beneath those words, there was a current I couldn't ignore. Every time his gaze met mine, I felt a warmth spread through me, a warmth I hadn't felt in years. There was a moment when our hands brushed as I passed him the sugar, and the touch lingered longer than it should have. It was nothing, really, just skin against skin, but it sent a shiver through me. I pulled my hand back quickly, trying to laugh it off, but inside I was shaken. That single touch had said more than an entire conversation could. I told myself again and again that it was harmless. But harmless things don't make your heart race when you're alone in bed at night, replaying every look, every word, every brush of the hand. Harmless things don't make you choose your clothes more carefully before stepping outside, hoping he might notice. Harmless things don't make you feel alive when you had almost forgotten what it meant. It wasn't long before our moments together grew longer. Sometimes he helped me carry groceries in, sometimes he stayed just a little too long after fixing something around the house. And each time, the silence between us grew heavier, filled with something unsaid yet undeniably present. One evening, as the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, we found ourselves walking together down the quiet street. The world felt softer somehow, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that invites confessions. I told him how I often felt invisible, how years of marriage had made me question if I was still the same woman I once was. He listened, really listened, without judgment or interruption. And when he finally spoke, his words were simple but pierced straight into me. "You're not invisible," he said softly. "You're more present than you realize." I didn't know how to respond. My throat tightened, and I could only look away, because in that moment I knew exactly what was happening. My heart was leaning toward him, and every rational thought I had was losing its grip. That night, I sat awake while David slept beside me, his steady breathing filling the room. I stared at the ceiling, torn between guilt and longing. I hadn't crossed any line physically, but my heart had already betrayed him. I had already begun giving pieces of myself to someone else, and the weight of it pressed heavily against me. The next time Ethan came by, the air between us was different. It wasn't just unspoken tension anymore, it was something undeniable. We sat close on the couch, talking quietly about nothing and everything, and there was a moment when his arm brushed against mine. Neither of us moved away. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, and I let myself lean just slightly closer, almost without realizing it. I knew it was dangerous, but I didn't pull back. For years, I had been starved of touch, of closeness, of intimacy that was more than just routine. And here it was, tempting me in the most subtle yet powerful way. When our eyes met, the world seemed to pause. There was no kiss, no grand gesture, just a look, long and unbroken, that said everything we couldn't. In that silence, I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also more alive than I had in a long time. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I almost forgot to breathe, and yet, the guilt didn't vanish. It lingered, waiting for me in the quiet moments after Ethan left. I found myself caught between two lives, the one I had built with David, safe and predictable but empty, and the one I was secretly creating with Ethan, thrilling but dangerous. Martha noticed it again one afternoon when we met for coffee. She leaned across the table, her eyes sharp, and asked if there was someone else. I froze, almost spilling my cup, before shaking my head too quickly. But she saw it in my face, in the hesitation I couldn't hide. She didn't push, though. She simply sighed and said, "Be careful, Clara. Temptation always feels sweet, but it leaves a bitter aftertaste." Her words echoed in my mind long after, but they didn't stop me. By then, it was too late. I had already crossed a line in my heart, a line I couldn't erase. I told myself I could still control it, that I wouldn't let it go further, but deep down, I knew control was slipping through my fingers. The truth was simple: I wanted Ethan. Not just his presence, not just his quiet comfort, I wanted the way he made me feel. Desired. Seen. Alive, and in that wanting, I knew I was risking everything.